Welcome to a special episode of Bridge Elections FAQ. It's also a special lunch break crossover episode. It's the day after the election, and we have a lot to talk about. I'm Isabel Lohman, the education reporter at Bridge, Michigan. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet in the state, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have Capitol reporters Jordan Hermany, Simon Schuster, and Lauren Gibbons here. We also have data reporter Mike Wilkinson, who's been up since the early morning crunching numbers. They're going to answer your questions about the election results. Let us know what we're still waiting on and answer any other questions you have about the election. As of 11:45 on Wednesday, when we're recording this, former President Donald Trump has won the Electoral College votes to return to the White House, but the AP, the Associated Press, has not yet called Michigan. We're still waiting to see what happens. He currently leads Michigan with about 90,000 votes. We're going to start with reporters' analysis of the election results, and then we'll turn to your audience questions. So you can put them in the chat, and we will try our best to answer those. If you missed part of today's discussion, you can go to YouTube, where you'll be able to see the full recording. And if you'd like to support this event and other free events for our readers, you can join our membership community, and we'll put a link in the chat as well. So we've got the full Capitol team here, plus Mike. They're caffeinated. They're ready to go. Simon, Jordan, Lauren, Mike, what was the biggest surprise of the evening?
Yeah, I think if one thing was not particularly surprising coming out of this election, it was how accurate this was for the polling. I think we were all shocked in 2016 when Trump pulled out his 11,000 vote victory in Michigan. And then in 2020, we saw then candidate Joe Biden up by as much as 7 points at certain points. And then, coming through with just a little over 2 percentage point victory. And here we saw these candidates neck and neck. And while we're still waiting for the last few votes to trickle in, that's exactly where these vote totals are in Michigan as well. But in terms of what was surprising to me, I think it was sort of the extent to which Democrats failed in this election to not make this a referendum on the current administration. I think it's always difficult when you have a sitting, this is a rare scenario, but having a sitting vice president, having the president bow out and then having the sitting vice president have to run on that. Joe Biden was a deeply unpopular president, and Kamala Harris, before she, entered the race and became the presidential nominee, was a deeply unpopular vice president. And it seemed like, for all this talk about different issues, different reaching out to different groups, that the fundamentals of the race really never changed. And really, we saw this reflected, I think, in, I think there was an anticipation or an expectation among Democrats that people's feelings towards Donald Trump are going to remain consistent for the entirety of the electorate. But the numbers right now that we're seeing really show that that's not the case. And that's because, quite simply, relative to 2020, Donald Trump has 141,000 more votes in Michigan than he did in the last election. And that's, I think, something that's a triumph, a strategic triumph for the campaign, because when you look at his prior two campaigns, it was sort of just the man himself out there campaigning. Really, the campaign itself, the apparatus, was formed around him, the things he said and the things he wanted to do. But there was much more of a bifurcation this time around. He had a more professional campaign staff that was more disciplined, more on message, and offering a robust policy platform. And so while Trump was still there, winning over his base of support with his personality, with his improvisations on stage, some of the wild things that he'd say, on the other half, there was a much more traditional campaign. And it offered a pretty detailed vision for what they wanted to do for the country. And I think that the vote totals that we're seeing today really reflect that.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me was, coming out of 2016, I think everyone was surprised by what happened both nationally and in Michigan. And it was, where are these people, right? Where are the Trump supporters that gave him this nearly 11,000 vote victory? And I think now it's going to be pretty clear that you might want to go knock on the door of your neighbor. I looked at the totals in places like Oakland County, which just gave, Joe Biden a huge victory in 2020. And it's 20,000 votes fewer in 2024. And it's in a couple different communities. I mean, Trump flipped, 3 communities within Oakland County that had supported him and then supported Biden. He flipped them back. He flipped Saginaw County, he flipped Muskegon County. So, I mean, the idea of where are these people? You look among you. Maybe you saw a couple extra Trump signs in your neighborhood that you hadn't seen before. Maybe go talk to them, because it wasn't, where he just got his support in rural Michigan. He did get a lot of support there. It was up substantially, which was, we had 14 counties where he got over 70% of the vote. That's up from 7 in 2020. But it was a pretty widespread change. We don't know if it's a victory yet. I mean, there still could be numbers that makes it close. But we know that the trends that we saw in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Georgia were also found here. And even if he only wins by 1 percentage point in Michigan, that's still 55,000 votes. That's a lot of votes.
Absolutely.
I think the biggest. Ooh.
Go ahead, Jordan.
I apologize. I think the biggest for me, and I'll just say it quickly, was the Harris administration's underplaying of the uncommitted and, by extension, war in Gaza efforts, these protest votes. Obviously, you remember back in February during our presidential primary, there was about 100,000 people who voted uncommitted. And, you know, those voters, by and large, we saw that Harris lost Dearborn, one of Michigan's, a predominantly Muslim community in Michigan. But Slotkin, for instance, went on to win Dearborn. During the final days of the race, we saw the Trump administration really start to play up anti-war efforts. He was in Dearborn itself. He was the first presidential candidate of the cycle to actually visit Dearborn, in the city, meet with voters there, meet with business leaders there. And I really think that they did not count on the fact that this movement that had been long downplayed or underplayed as sort of these fringe activists or people who might be unhappy with the administration but will come home to roost in November, that just never played out.
Yeah, one of the things I do want to note there too, it's something that I'm personally interested in very much is, you know, the Michigan Republican Party right now, we've got 3 vice chairs who are Muslim Americans as well. And we saw in 2022 too, a lot of these Arab Americans, especially like there was meetings at Dearborn Public Schools that were like, chaotic, almost, huge hubbubs were created because of social issues, the culture wars, and, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, aspects of these communities are deeply socially conservative. And that was certainly part of the appeal here too, as well, I'd have to say. But I'd be curious to, I don't think we can really easily disentangle the motivations of these voters. But I certainly agree with you that I think, the motivations between a lot of these votes were deeply influenced by that conflict as well. But I am sort of wondering, we saw a movement from Republicans towards Democrats during the Iraq War and after 9/11, and whether, this is the extent to which this might be a swing backwards. Is this how permanent this is in terms of an electoral shift?
Yeah, and I'll go a completely different direction than everyone else here. The thing that surprised me the most was compared to how the rest of the state did, how well Republicans did, was just the absolute dominance by Democratic nominated Supreme Court candidates. They were leading the entire night. There was a pretty resounding victory. And I think a lot of that goes to just the amount of investment that supporters of Bolden and Thomas put into this. She also got Thomas also got an endorsement from Elizabeth Clement, a sitting Republican nominated justice. And you didn't see quite as much investment on the ground from Republicans in that race. And I bet they're regretting that today.
Yeah, I want to say that's a great point, Lauren, because, for people to have voted for those Supreme Court candidates and voted for Trump, there was ticket splitting, and we saw it with Slotkin and we saw it with Rogers as well. And to me, it tells you that there was something really uncomfortable people had. I'm not sure if I phrased that correctly with the Biden-Harris administration. And I think it's the economy. I say that purposely that way. I was in Tecumseh yesterday talking to some voters, and I talked to a woman named Erin Gifford, who's like 48 or 47. And her husband lost her $27 an hour job and got replaced by a $12.50 an hour job in the last year and a half. That's real pain. And she said, she didn't even say it sarcastically. She said it with anger. She goes, even though they say it's a great economy, it's not for me. So, I think she probably always would have been a Trump supporter, but the pain that she was expressing was real. And I think that was, you would find that around the state, despite the fact that we have unemployment that is below 5%, which is historically low. High prices. And I think that's where we find ourselves today.
Yeah. If I can offer another note on that Supreme Court race as well, I think that, they have a huge tactical advantage starting off, right? Because they're on the nonpartisan section of the ballot. And when they appear in these races, they've got, at least in the case of Kyra Harris Bolden, they got Justice of the Supreme Court underneath their name. And that's that is huge to start off with because they don't know necessarily any sort of ideological affiliation. And the other things too, is that I think Republicans are going to have to decide moving forward whether they want to really make a serious attempt at contesting these races, because Democrats, they're raising good money, these candidates as well, but there's sort of an ecosystem of support. I'm a big campaign finance guy, of course, and there's an ecosystem of support that supports these Democratic nominees from outside groups like the Michigan Association of Justice, and even nationally justice-oriented groups, some of which are dark money organizations, poured millions of dollars into this race and gave them an enormous financial advantage. And unless Republicans, either at the national level or in the state as well, are going to want to make those kind of investments to win this over, I think they're going to really struggle in these races going forward.
Sure. And just like a note about the economy, I know we're jumping around a little bit. We had all the Bridge reporters yesterday were out in the field talking to voters all across the state, and the economy came up multiple times. We're going to continue to talk about the Supreme Court race, and Lauren has some insights about the State House in just a second. But Mike, you woke up early this morning and did a bunch of data crunching. Any surprises in specific municipalities or counties? What did you find?
Well, I kind of made some references to that, but I mean, it was just a consistent rightward shift, even in places that voted for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. There was just this consistent movement towards the right. And in the counties where Trump got them, where he won, turnout actually was up like 3%. In the counties that Harris won, it was down. So, I mean, there was just this, either people stayed home, didn't vote. So that's a sign of disaffection. And the people who wanted to vote, they wanted to vote for Trump. So I mentioned Tecumseh, which is in Lenawee County. Trump got 2 percentage points more than he got in 2020, and the turnout was up. The turnout in that county was up. It was just surprising me how widespread. And he still might lose, but he lost by 154,000 votes in 2020, and a lot of that had to do with the 228,000 vote margin in Detroit. Well, that margin is going to be closer to 200,000. And I just think it's just fascinating how just widespread it is, and I don't think any single issue can explain it all. It's just a kind of a collage, and I think it's just and I think Simon already mentioned is just this unhappiness with the way things have been and with the Biden-Harris administration. Whether you're a supporter of the Palestinian people, or whether you're upset about your job loss, the people just didn't like where things were going.
Sure. And another question that we got from a reader was they wanted to know if there was any impact of third-party candidate votes in this election.
Well, there were a couple places that you saw the third party vote really a lot higher. So in Wayne County, it was nearly 4%. Statewide, it was less than 2%. But overall, I mean, there was just fewer than 100,000 third party votes in an election with over 5.5 million people. In 2016, there was nearly 250,000 third party votes, and that clip surely played a role in Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton then. In 2020, there was around 90,000 votes. So in certain counties, yes, there was a substantial impact. I would presume in Oakland County that probably trimmed the margin, potentially 9,000 votes. Wayne County, maybe a little bit more. But I don't think that's the sole reason why we are seeing what we're seeing here, because that wasn't the issue in other parts of the country, because they just don't have the same population, the Arab and Muslim population here, for whom that was a very deciding issue in their motivations for voting.
For sure. And it's okay if you don't know the answer, but going to put you on the spot. We had a reader who asked what happened in Kent County. Did it go more blue, more red?
Well, there we go. Thank you. Yes, I do know. It did vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, but the margins there shrunk by over 2,000 votes. It's another one with one of the big counties. It had one of the biggest shifts from 2016 to 2020. It was over 30,000 votes towards, from being a Trump county to being a Biden county. That shrunk a little bit, as it shrunk on almost every single place in the state. So it wasn't just Metro Detroit. It was just about everywhere.
Thanks for that, Mike. And Lauren, you've been following the U.S. Senate race really close. Alyssa Slotkin is running against Mike Rogers. As of this recording, it's looking like Slotkin is leading, and it seems like she's been able to do better in the state than Harris has been able to. Do you have any insights on how that's happened?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was always a possibility. She was polling a little bit better than Harris throughout the months leading up to the campaign. It has come down to the wire. I'm looking at AP's numbers right now. So it's Slotkin has 48.5% of the vote and Rogers has 48.4% of the vote. That said, the remaining votes that need to get into the system are from Wayne County, heavily Democratic area. Slotkin's campaign has said they're very confident that they're going to come out with this. And that's a big bright spot for Democrats, not just in Michigan, but around the country, where the Senate returned to Republican majority controlled. Democrats had held it. There were a couple of pretty close races that went to Republicans, but this has been a seat that's been held by Democrats since 2000. And so you saw Senator Stabenow, who's leaving, Senator Gary Peters were out pretty hard for Slotkin in these last several weeks and months. And then it's also important to note that this really ultimately did come down to Wayne County. We've talked a lot about a lot of the concerns that voters in Dearborn, et cetera, had with the Harris administration. Slotkin seemed to avoid that to some extent, or not completely, perhaps. She was getting a lot of attack ads on that nature and on that issue, but in terms of the actual vote count, she still managed to pull ahead. So you either had people who were voting for Trump and Slotkin, or people who were skipping the president's race entirely and voting for Slotkin, at least barely enough to eke out a victory here.
That's really interesting. I'd love to talk to someone who voted for Trump and then voted for Slotkin. I think that'd be interesting to hear what their policy positions were. Simon, were you going to add something?
Yeah, if I could just add one small thing here. I think this was a sort of scenario that Alyssa Slotkin's entire political career has been building towards, right? She's someone who got elected, obviously, in Republican-leaning districts twice here. And that, I think, the ability to campaign in that style and the ability to sort of target voters in that way and message, even if your voting record in Congress and the policy support might not necessarily be that purple or that leaning red, the ability to sort of campaign in that mode is hugely advantageous. I think we saw sort of the inverse of that in the 7th congressional district, when Curtis Hertel, someone who'd been like a state senator, representing East Lansing, had never really had a competitive race in that regards, where he had to appear extremely moderate. Obviously he lost against Tom Barrett last night, the Republican. Whereas Slotkin, this is someone who was really comfortable in those shoes and messaging in that way, and she did that very consistently throughout the entirety of her campaign. I think
to that point, Slotkin has been treating this race as though it would come down to the wire from the second she entered it, almost 2 years ago. At this point, she was one of the first to throw her name in, mostly cleared the primary field right away from a lot of potentially well-funded primary challengers. She's been raising so much money. She's been spending a ton of time in Wayne County. Like, she was basically living in Detroit. She was constantly in these campaign events in Southeast Michigan, because that was an area that she wasn't quite as well known in. And ultimately, if the current results pan out, it paid off. She didn't need that many votes to eke it out. If it comes down to what it's looking like right now, she was successful in that regard.
Yeah, I don't know if you could really, I've never heard of a congressional candidate before who's had 3 nationally significant razor tight elections in a row. It's really something that I don't know if we've ever seen before. I guess 4 at this point, right? Yeah, 4.
Well, you get to cover her, so you're going to hear a lot more about this candidate. Republicans appear likely to flip the Michigan House following a costly cutthroat battle over the 110 seats. Who are the new faces of the legislature?
Yeah, so I can speak to this. I've been following it for a long time. This was always going to be an uphill battle for Democrats. This was a really, really close majority, even in 2022. They had 56-54, and that was a year where Governor Gretchen Whitmer was in a double-digit lead. She was, a very successful Democratic candidate at the top of the ticket, and Democrats still had 56-54. It was a 2-seat margin. It was so close. And with Trump on the ballot, a lot of people were saying, a lot of people were looking at some of these seats in Macomb County, downriver, Southwest Michigan to some extent, and saying, it's pretty close. Republicans have a good shot here. So I don't necessarily think it was a huge surprise that Republicans did manage to eke out the victory. I think one of the biggest surprises when it comes to the state house, they were really going hard for the 109th district in the Upper Peninsula. It's the last remaining state house seat above the Mackinac Bridge that was Democratic. It was long been controlled by Democrats because it represents the city of Marquette. But the candidate up there on the Republican side was very well known, ran a very aggressive campaign. He ultimately won that race, and so it's being represented by a Republican for the first time in decades. So that was a big win for Republicans. That said, though, Democrats did have some pretty significant victories as well. It could have been worse for Democrats in terms of some of these very competitive seats. Betsy Kofia also in northern Michigan in the Traverse City area, she was able to keep her seat. There were a couple of other pretty close races where incumbent Democrats did manage to win, but yeah, it's 58-52 is a lot different than 56-54. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens.
For sure. And this means that, come January, the Republicans would lead the House, the Democrats would lead the Senate. Gretchen Whitmer is still the governor, so you're going to have to work across party lines to get things through. And it's also the last 2 years of Whitmer's term as governor. So always looking forward. What does this mean for lame duck? Lame duck is that time between the election and the new party coming in. What kind of legislation or ideas or policies can we expect to see in the next several weeks?
Yeah, so it's much the same, honestly, as when they adjourned back in the end of June. We haven't seen the House in session, except for, I believe, one scant time later in the campaign season. So there's a lot of outstanding issues that Democrats have promised from back in January. We have, if you remember, the Supreme Court case that effectively would raise minimum wage next year and establish sick time laws. Business leaders and restaurateurs, restaurant workers as well, have said that they don't want this change that's going to go into effect should the Michigan legislature not try and act in some regard to curb changes that could be coming, and that would raise minimum wage up to $15 an hour by 2029. Restaurants are not in favor of that, obviously. They're not in favor of a big jump that's going to increase their minimum wage or their tipped wage employees, which is those individuals who, as the name suggests, relies on tips. They don't make a minimum wage, but restaurants are required to make up the difference at the end of their shift if they don't kind of match those levels of income. So that's a big one that's on the table. There's been a lot of chatter for Democrats to do that, come back even before the election and get that handled, and they didn't. Then there's also the case of open records acts. Democrats, including Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who in her gubernatorial campaign ran on a platform of trying to open up government to the people. There's been no movement since, gosh, I'm blanking at this point. It's been that long, that on a series of bills that would basically allow constituents to be able to FOIA parts of the legislature and parts of the governor's office. There's no movement there. Big campaign issue for Democrats. That's still out on the table. And then we have some other smaller stuff. And I say small, but it's not inconsequential by any stretch of the word, such as monies for SOAR, the Strategic Attraction and Outreach Reserve Fund, if I'm remembering that correctly off the top of my head. There's still some outstanding dollars that are clamoring to be spent there, and it's any wonder what Democrats are going to get to while they still have their trifecta for the limited amount of time they still have it.
It's going to be a busy few weeks, end of the year for sure. We had some reader questions coming in. One of them wanted us to pontificate a little bit on what we know about the gubernatorial race. As we mentioned, Whitmer is not up for re-election. So in 2026, do any of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, we started to see to some extent this year, potential candidates lining themselves up, especially on the Democratic side for what could be a very, very competitive primary. If some of the names that we're seeing come up frequently and speculation do end up getting into it, Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan, for example, or Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson have both expressed interest. Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist's name has come up a number of times. There's a lot of possibilities. There's a pretty deep Democratic bench at the statewide level. On the Republican side, we've seen some previous names, people who tried to get at it in 2022 who may be interested again, Tudor Dixon, Kevin Rinke. And there's also possibility, especially with a Republican controlled House, that someone emerges from there, emerges as a leader, who might try to come out and to, maybe make their case. It's still really early, but we will start hearing it now that the election is in the books. You're going to start seeing people either make outright bids or really get their affairs in order to prepare for those campaigns.
Well, and maybe it's a
It's like,
moonshot too, but if you remember, Mayor Pete moved to Michigan a few years back now, a little while back now, and there's been some chatter too as to whether or not he's going to toss his hat in the ring for governor. Lots of people are very interested in Pete Buttigieg. Whether or not he is going to actually bite on that, your guess is as good as mine.
well, and he'll soon be out of a job because I don't think Donald Trump is going to put him as a transportation secretary either. You mentioned the Republican side is maybe a little less clear in terms of who is showing interest in 2026. We had a reader question who wanted to know if Pete Hoekstra, the Michigan GOP chair who came in this year, he was Trump endorsed, if he made a difference in terms of these top ballot and down ballot races.
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest with you, I think that we would have to say probably undeniably yes. But not necessarily because there was some sort of strategic mastery or brilliance at work here. Although certainly, they did do a lot of effort. There was staff was set up. I think we should probably provide some readers some background that Christina Caramo was elected chair in March 2023 February, and had been chair until earlier this year. When she was ousted by a minority of the state board, and then Pete Hoekstra was subsequently elected, and a court case then made him permanently chair for the remainder of this term. And so that was, basically the day of the presidential primary this year. And so in very short order, Hoekstra then had to erect a campaign infrastructure both for the party, and then hire on staff and begin fundraising because the party itself had very little money. And in large part, they were successful in that. We see from disclosed party accounts, such as with the Federal Election Commission, that they did substantial fundraising in that time to the order of tens of millions of dollars. And at the same time, the importance of a state party in an election year is to be a trustworthy conduit of some of the national and federal money that pours into the state. In terms of volunteer mail, millions of dollars in presidential mail flows through the state party during a presidential election. And we saw that happen this year. And under Christina Caramo, we had very public displays where the House Republican Congressional Committee, which is sort of the organizing arm for the U.S. House's efforts to win the majority, had big concerns about whether Caramo would actually use the money in the way that they wanted to. Legally, they're not allowed to earmark that money, but there's sort of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge agreement between state parties and groups like this that they're going to use it at the seats that groups like the HRCC want to target. And so we saw that, sort of they became a good faith actor there and were able to spend some of that money. But then also when we saw the administrative account, a source of dark money that's used particularly in state legislative elections, they were spending $5, $6, close to $10 million, I believe, by the end of the election cycle to support some of these candidates, helping them win this legislative majority. And so we had very little evidence that Christina Caramo had raised anywhere near that amount of money. And so it played certainly an important role. And then also as a coordinating function for some of these get out the vote efforts as we reach the final stages of the presidential campaign.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And then there was a lot of talk about democracy, both with Democrats saying that Trump is a threat to democracy, and some Republicans pushing back on the idea that Harris was selected without a primary process. I'm curious, when you all were talking to voters yesterday, did this topic come up?
Yeah, I think I could speak to that a little bit. I think I should say first off, when this was a much bigger topic of conversation a little bit earlier in the election cycle. And sometimes I think when you talk about the erosion of democracy, people think about Trump as a quote unquote dictator or president for life. I often like to ask sort of Trump supporters, really hardcore little fans, would you support Trump for a third or even fourth presidential term? And a lot of them actually told me no, which I found, not necessarily surprising, but at least reaffirming, right, that sort of enabling mechanisms wouldn't necessarily happen. And at the same time, too, a lot of Republicans and Democrats alike had a lot of concerns about Harris sort of being elected in a quote unquote undemocratic way. And sometimes in these conversations, you'd have to have sort of an in-person fact check and have to note that, well, the party's primary process is not a democratic process. There's not election laws that they have to necessarily adhere to. These are internal affairs that, in the case of Michigan, the state holds as a courtesy to these parties, and they don't get to make up the rules for these things. And ultimately, the parties can do whatever they want in terms of selecting a presidential nominee. And so, it came up from time to time, but I can't say that it often dominated our conversations. In exit polls, we saw that it was a big concern for some people. Certainly, I would say when we go down to the presidential race and into the general election, that a fair number of people talked to me about January 6, 2021, and how that is influencing their vote. But obviously, we see that it was not a majority of voters were basing their decision around these sort of events, or even the criminal cases that are pending against the former president, but are likely to be thrown out once he's inaugurated.
Thank you for that. I think we've all learned a lot about the process of voting this year, whether it's how do people pick who comes next when the sitting president drops out, or how do these parties and these different party processes work out? Even with the Pete Hoekstra situation, how do political parties pick their next leader? So thank you for that, Simon. So we've gone through a lot of reader questions today. I think we've gotten to most of them. If you have any more questions, throw them in the chat and we'll try to get to them. Lauren, a quick one for you, since you've been following him pretty closely. Someone wanted to know, if Mike Rogers doesn't win today, could he run for governor in 2 years?
It's important to note that he has not conceded, and it's still not officially called. So I don't pretend to have any I don't pretend to have any insight onto what he's thinking right now. But he certainly made clear that he is a formidable statewide candidate. The fact that it is this close. Even though he was, especially with Slotkin's fundraising advantage throughout this campaign, he ran a really aggressive campaign, and he, made a lot of moves to kind of unite both the Trump fan base and some of the other members of the GOP. He was trying to be sort of a uniting figure, and even if the current numbers bear out, he came pretty close. So I don't know if he would want to necessarily try to run for governor, but depending on the circumstances, sure, his name could certainly be an option.
Sure. Thank you for that, Lauren. Well, we're just about to wrap up. We're so thankful that everyone has spent their time with us today. We, like I said multiple times in this call, we spent our time yesterday talking to voters across the state. We also spent the last several months going to rallies, fact checking candidates, and trying to get to the bottom of what these different policies would mean for both Michigan and the country. So I want to leave on a final note, a final question to all of our reporters. We've asked you in the past, what food did you eat before the election? We've asked you what your biggest surprise is. Can you name one issue that you're going to be looking forward in the next several weeks or months when it comes to Michigan policy? Lauren, let's start with you.
All right. Well, I am very curious to know what a lack of trifecta means for the Michigan House and the Michigan legislature generally in the next 2 years. As you brought up earlier, it's the last 2 years of Governor Whitmer's term. It's a lot different to have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate than it is to have a outright Democratic majority. So we'll see, whether that results in tempering priorities or trying to come up with, bipartisan solutions that could appease. But I'm also very curious to see, how House Republican leadership handles this power. They've really spent the last 2 years being a sort of thorn in the side for House Democrats who were trying to pass policies, basically made it so no one could be absent if they wanted to get a vote through on a lot of key issues, because no Republicans were going to cross the line and vote bipartisan on a lot of things. So that's something I'm very curious about, to see what happens there, and if Republicans and Democrats can agree on some stuff like the state budget.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely leaves the question open for how much Republicans, frankly, even want to work in these coming weeks that Democrats still have left. Obviously, they do have a majority in the House, but I mean, it's razor thin. And if they are missing a member, we're down to a 55-55 split. Republicans can just dig their heels in, as they've done throughout the kind of start of this term, and say, hey, we're not interested. We'll see you next year. And here's the policies that we want to work on. And it'll be very interesting too to see how Democrats in the House actually will recoup, considering the surrounding of House Speaker Joe Tate initially was very positive. Democrats were able to get sort of historic things done in the first half of this 2-year term. You're thinking about codifying LGBTQ protections into the state Civil Rights Act, repealing right to work. There's any number of things. And now, you saw earlier this year, Democrats begin to distance themselves from Tate due to what seems like from the outside, some conversation and misunderstanding of a vote that was held regarding teacher pensions. And so the Democrats are now going to be forced with a reckoning of who is going to be leading their caucus in the coming year, because that individual is going to be more than likely facing or pairing up with a House Majority Leader, House Speaker Matt Hall, who is now the Minority Leader in the State House currently, and whether or not that individual will be able to work with him and be able to push policy priorities that Democrats currently have, but in a way that will be bipartisan and workable.
Yeah, I know that Isabel, you asked us about policy, but I've got to go to something that's a little bit adjacent, but certainly politically related. And I think one of the things that's on the tip of my mind, the day after this election, is that we spent the last few years, there's been sort of an assumption among Democrats, among moderates, that some of the conduct after the 2020 election regarding January 6, 2021, the certification of false electors, trying to provide an alternative slate of electors to the state, and then also attempts from some actors to, they acquired voting machines and looked into them, that these sort of ideas that people have cast as really nefarious attempts to subvert the elections were this unforgivable offense that connected back to former President Donald Trump, and that disqualified him for further office. I think the results of this election show undeniably that Michigan voters and voters nationally don't see these things that way. And so we have criminal trials coming up, both with this slate of false electors and with these individuals, including Matt DePerno and former state rep Dare Rendon, that addressing these charges. And so, if these things go to trial, they're going to have jury selection, and we're going to see, how a relatively randomly selected pool of jurors are going to feel about some of these things within this new political context, a sort of sea change, perhaps an opinion on these things. I mean, I know that we had a question from Brian in the chat asking the policies that helped Trump, and it was by and large the economy, and that, he stole Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign slogan, asking folks, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And clearly, a large portion of Michigan voters felt that they were not, and we're able to, sort of focus on this economy over some of these issues, such as the state of the democracy. And I want to see, where these cases are going to go, how prosecutors tackle some of these issues, and if these charges can move forward, even as we move towards Donald Trump's inauguration. And we see him effectively pardon himself, or have the Department of Justice stop prosecuting him in some of these cases related to alleged subversion of democracy and trying to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power.
I also had one other thing that I wanted to add, since we already gamed out the 2026 gubernatorial election a little bit. It is also very important to think about the state Senate. The state Senate has also been a very slim majority. Democrats won that back for the first time in decades in 2022. And one of the big unknowns right now is Kristen McDonald-Rivette, who is currently a state senator in Michigan, but just won election in a very competitive congressional seat. Now, that seat is not given for Democrats. That is a very competitive state Senate seat. A special election will need to be called. Republicans are very likely going to put up a fight there. So that could even fiddle with the Democrats' current very slim majority in the state Senate. But also in 2026, that is going to be a very competitive race as well. It's not just the state House that Democrats need to defend. The state Senate, you're already seeing a ton of vulnerable Democrats raising a lot of money for this. They were reporting that even in a non-election year for them, they have been thinking about it very closely, because perhaps even more so than the state House, Democrats are really proud of flipping the Senate, and they want to keep it that way. So that's something that I will continue to be watching for the next 2 years.
Get a lot of plans, Lauren.
If I could add just one more additional thing, I did want to note that one of the big surprises for me in this election actually was the popularity of early in-person voting. And that's because in the first two elections where this was widely available statewide this year, it was not widely adopted at all. The first few days in the February presidential primary, we saw like 15,000 voters. I believe the first day was only about 8,000 voters. And now it has been highly promoted by both parties and broadly adopted. We saw 10 times that amount go in this first few days of this election. It's obviously going to become a big mechanic and something that's seemingly more advantageous to, or is Republicans are benefiting more from than mail-in voting in the future. And how this is going to impact the dynamics of our elections moving forward, I think it's going to be significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw just how popular that was in parts of the state. Well, thank you all so much for being here today, both our audience members and our reporters. Lauren, Simon, Jordan, I know you've had a long night, long week, long few months, and we're so grateful for all the reporting you're doing. The reason Mike Wilkinson isn't on this call anymore is because he's crunching more numbers. So we'll have even more analysis in just a little bit. Over the last several months, we've tried to answer as many reader questions as we can related to the 2024 election. And we're so grateful that you spent part of your morning, part of your afternoons with us. If you have questions about the elections, you can continue to ask us questions on our website. We've said this before, but some of those races aren't called, so you can continue to go to our website, bridgemi.com, for any of the latest updates on those races. And you can be sure that we're going to be tracking all these different policy proposals, the laws that might be coming through, and everything both on the state level and on the national level. Bridge Michigan's mission is to make Michigan a better place through nonprofit engagement and reporting, and we're trying to do that as best as possible. So we hope you have a good rest of your afternoon, and thank you for spending part of your day with us.